What's going on, everybody? Welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be taking a look at David Johnson, his fantasy outlook for the upcoming 2020 NFL season. And like most of you, I think we were all pretty shocked that the Texans decided to trade for David Johnson. And if you just heard that they traded for David Johnson, it's like, okay, why not? He's a somewhat good player. But then you hear that they trade DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best receivers in the NFL, for a guy who hasn't performed super good as of late. And I think lots of people are confused and wondering, why would you ever do that? Why would you trade one of your best receivers for a running back who last year was a 37th ranked running back in fantasy football? It's pretty confusing. It doesn't really make much sense, but that's sort of where we are right now. And so that's what we have to look at right now. How will David Johnson do on this Houston Texans team with Deshaun Watson, no longer DeAndre Hopkins on that team? How will he perform in the 2020 fantasy football season? So if we take a look back at David Johnson, his history, some of his past in fantasy football, how he's done in the past. Of course, we all know he had that great year, the 2016 season. He finished as a number one fantasy running back, came out of nowhere, put up great numbers. He ran the ball 293 times for 1,239 yards, 16 touchdowns rushing, and then he had 80 receptions for 879 yards and 4 touchdowns. And so one of the biggest factors for his success in 2016 was the fact that he was just a massive dual threat. He could run the ball, he could receive the ball. And if you take a look at sort of where they played him in 2016, the Cardinals, in 2016 he played in the slot 76 times and out wide 121 times. So he was being utilized all around the field. He wasn't just there in the backfield. And with him being split out in all these different areas, he was able to pick up 80 receptions, which from a running back is just crazy numbers. But then after 2016, he comes out in 2017, injures himself. I remember that because I picked him after 2016. I think I picked him as like the second pick in the first round with some of my friends that I have a fantasy league with. I picked him. And so he got injured. That was terrible. Sort of messed up your season when your first pick running back ends up getting injured very soon into your season. It's just sort of it just messes you up, just messes you up. But anyways, that's the past. But 2017, he's injured, nothing really happens. Okay, so we assume 2018, he'll probably do better, and he did do better. He finished as a 10th running back in 2018. He played in all 16 games. He ran the ball 258 times for 940 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns, and then he had 50 receptions for 446 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. So he did pretty good in 2018. And I think coming into 2019, people expected, they had high hopes for him. They thought maybe this guy can improve on last season and be that guy we saw in 2016. But did that happen? That did not happen. And why did that happen? I think that in 2019, he comes in and he's with a new coach, Cliff Kingsbury. And lots of people thought that they would utilize him a lot. But he got injured a little bit. They decided to trade for Kenyon Drake. He comes in and he basically takes over and he becomes a guy that they'd rather prefer to use. Because if you take a look, in the prior 2 years of 2019, the Cardinals used David Johnson 80+% of snaps prior to 2019, those 2 years. But in 2019, they only used him in 42% of the snaps. And so obviously we see that they just sort of stopped using him as much as they had used him in the past. And because of that, he finished last season as the 37th running back on that team. And another interesting stat to look at is in the 2017 and 2018 season, which is basically mostly the 2018 season because he didn't really play in 2017. He lined up in the slot 25 times and out wide 22 times, which is around 150 times less than in the 2016 season. So we see that one reason he didn't do as well in 17 and 18 as 2016 is they didn't really utilize him as much as they used to, spreading him all around the field. And because of that, his fantasy numbers did suffer. And so I think now looking at him coming onto this Texans offense with Deshaun Watson, I think lots of people have questions as to whether he can be the guy that we used to see, the number one running back in 2016. Can he still put up running back one numbers? And personally, I think it is possible. I think his upside this upcoming season is to see running back one numbers. And just think about this for a second. The Texans decided to trade for David Johnson, and most people think they're stupid to make that decision. They think, why would you trade DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best receivers, for David Johnson? And so I think now, with David Johnson on their team, the people who made this decision sort of have to want to prove to other people that it wasn't such a bad decision. They at least need to see David Johnson put up some pretty solid numbers to just to reaffirm that they made somewhat of a good decision. So I think that's one reason to believe that they would utilize him. That's not very statistical, but that's just one reason. Like, why would they not utilize him like crazy? Because they want to show people why they traded for him. And for them to trade him in the first place, they had to think that he was a great player who still has potential in 2020. So I personally do think that. The only problem, though, is I don't know what his floor is. There's sort of lots of uncertainty because maybe he comes in, he injures himself, and he's been injured in the past. I don't know if it's that big of a problem, but it's still definitely a possibility. And who knows, maybe he's just not the player that he used to be. And maybe last season in 2019, the reason they decided to bring in Kenyon Drake and use him more was because maybe David Johnson is getting older and he doesn't really have the talent and skill set that he used to have. So that is sort of the uncertainty, and that's why he's currently being picked as a 23rd running back off the board right now if you take a look at Fantasy Pros ADP. And because this video is being filmed on June 11th, that is the day that this ADP is from. So if you're watching this later, it could have changed by then. So just keep that into account. So in 2019, Carlos Hyde ran the ball for over 1,000 yards on this Texans offense. And I think that you can make the argument that David Johnson is better than Carlos Hyde. I think you can make the argument. And so I think that there's no reason that David Johnson can't run for over 1,000 yards in 2020 with the Texans. And another factor to look at is DeAndre Hopkins is leaving this team. And that's about 150 targets per year that DeAndre Hopkins sort of averaged. And so those targets are going to have to go somewhere. And of course, lots of them are going to go to the receivers, Fuller, Randall Cobb, some of those guys. But I think also David Johnson will get a lot of balls in the receiving game, in the passing game, and maybe they will utilize him more like he used to be utilized, sort of out wide a little bit. We'll see if that actually happens. But I think there's reason to believe that he will have a good amount of receptions. The only one problem holding him back in that area is you have Duke Johnson on this team, who is a very good receiving back. He isn't really as much as a running threat to David Johnson because he's only ran the ball over 100 times once his entire career. So Duke Johnson is just only holding him back a little bit probably when it comes to his reception upside, but I still think that Carlos Hyde will put up a good amount of receptions in 2020. And so I sort of think that David Johnson is a good guy to target in your drafts because if you take a look where he's being picked as a 23rd running back, people remember what he did last year. And of course, there is a fear and a worry that that could possibly happen again. But at the same time, I personally think that there is a higher likelihood of him putting up numbers like he used to put up. Maybe not as much as like that number one season, but I do think that he has a potential to be a running back one in 2020. And so with him being picked as a 23rd running back at this point, that is definitely a lot of value if he can put up those numbers. And the fact that you're not really having to risk that much being picked as a 23rd running back. I mean, there's just not too much risk. And sometimes in fantasy football, you have to take risks and take calculated risks. And I think that this could be a guy that you could take a risk on. And if he ends up putting up running back one numbers, that is a great, very, very, very valuable pick. And so that's basically my thoughts on David Johnson in this 2020 season. Feel free to comment your thoughts below about what you think about David Johnson. If you agree with what I've said, if you don't agree, feel free to share it down below. But I hope you guys got some value from this video. And if you did, feel free to like it down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, I post videos about 5 times a week about fantasy football and the Green Bay Packers. So if you want to see more of that, feel free to subscribe to this channel. But that's going to be all for this video. I really appreciate you guys. If you watched this far, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys on the next video.